Welcome back, baseball fans. 1972-75 off-season look of the 72-75 season coming up next year. And we did this last week, and we showed you what the draft order and what has to happen in the off-season. Here's your draft order. Teams 1 through 32. Of course, the Pirates beat the Tigers in the World Series, 32-31. Ohio had the worst record in baseball. They get the first pick in the draft. All picks. No league makes 3 consecutive picks. We have gotten to a before-after, but we have really just taken a peek tonight with the 8 teams at the top. And it doesn't mean this is complete by any stretch. This is the first batch of player movement. We're going to do this series in 4 weeks. We're going to start teams 1 through 8, and then we'll do another quarter, and another quarter, and another quarter. And that's how we'll do the approach of player movement in the off season. We have a trade carousel. We move players along. We have tokens added and subtracted to make deals more balanced. We're striving to get to 128 keepers, 64 waives, 64 retirements. We began with 138 and 68, and we're down to 136, 70, and 50. So we're getting closer. We moved 2 keepers into waivers, but we still have plenty of work to do. So let's just get started right out. We have the guys teams wanted to keep, just a general notepad. These are just notes. I kind of want to emphasize that. These aren't locked in stone yet. And then we have a wish list of what they want to do in the off season. And we begin with the first team on the clock, the Ohio players, who want to make a splash in the trade. And they got on the phone with the Oakland A's, a team that has not won a World Series with those players of the Dynasty era yet, though the 69, 70, and 71 Oakland players are usually better than the 72, 73, and 4 versions of them as they're younger. But maybe it will happen this fall. However, could you get Vida Blue away from the Oakland A's? And the answer is yes, they did, in a blockbuster deal. And this was mostly to get the first pick in the draft, as Ohio, an expansion team, really didn't have anybody that has a Hall of Fame or All-Star gleam on them. So they noticed, of course, Vida Blue is your 1971 American League Most Valuable Player. He'll never perform that well again, though he's still an amazing pitcher for the whole decade. He is the guy to go after, and let's look at the transaction. We're going to go right up here, and this is the first transaction. I'll scroll it up right here for you. So the Oakland A's and the Ohio players made a deal. It was a deal involving the rights to 2 players and an active player on the roster. And this is a win-win for both teams. The rest of the American League might cringe about Oakland, and then they might look at this trade and go, you know what, that's not a bad deal. The fact that Oakland loses Vida Blue might make Oakland haters happy. However, it cost them 2 quality starting pitchers. We begin with Don Wilson, who, though he was with Houston, Houston lost him in the expansion draft. And Houston's deep in right-handed pitching anyway. They have Larry Dierker, Ken Forsch, and J.R. Richards. So they had no more room for Don Wilson anyway. Al Downing, a lefty who was with the Dodgers, they didn't have any room for a lefty. Dodgers had Claude Osteen, Tommy John, and Jim Brewer. So both these guys became available in the expansion draft to Ohio. They are on the short shelf life. Tragically for Don Wilson, he passed away after the 1974 season. Al Downing continues to play through the middle 70s. But what we do know is that Vida Blue will continue to pitch beyond Oakland. He pitches for the Giants and with Kansas City, and he'll pitch into the early 80s. And they also have Lynn McLaughlin, who will outlast Vince Colbert. McLaughlin has a nice year with St. Louis in the future. And so what you're getting here is the Oakland A's are getting two pitchers, Don Wilson and Al Downing, to join Kenny Holtzman and Catfish Hunter in the American League West. Oh my God. So yeah, if there is going to be a Dynasty A team, the Dynasty A's are going to have to pony up for arguably the best starting rotation in baseball. Catfish Hunter, Kenny Holtzman, Don Wilson, Al Downing. Vince Colbert, who's pretty bad, will probably be cut. Oakland also had to give a token, a draft pick, a move in the draft, is what we call it, a draft token, to Ohio to complete the deal. So the young Ohio team gets a flashy superstar to be the first player announced in the draft next year. They get a draft token, and they have a future with these two guys. And Oakland is honing in on the years 72, 73, 74 for Don Wilson and Al Downing so they can win a World Series or two or three. So that was the first moves. Looking at the keeper list here, there was Orlando Cepeda was also a keeper in that the Ohio team asked for, and Oakland didn't really need him anymore either. So props to this Ohio team for getting the token, getting the extra hitter, Orlando Cepeda, who's very old, but he can still hit for another year or two, and getting an improved Lynn McLaughlin or Vince Colbert. So that was a pretty expensive price for the Oakland A's. When we look here, Ohio kept the same math, 40202. They really could go into the draft this way, with keeping Vida Blue, Orlando Cepeda, Doc Ellis, and Ike Brown. So they did what they needed to do. They got the guy on their wish list. And Oakland, way down here, they're going to protect Dick Green and these two pitchers, Don Wilson and Al Downing. So they did a nice job right there. Next up, Florida Marlins and Kansas City Royals did not do anything flashy at all. They just balanced the books at this point. One team had an extra keeper. One team had an extra retired player. When we look at the transaction sheet, after the fireworks of the first deal, the second trade, and this is going to be probably the most common trade, a retired player for a waived player. That's simply to balance the books. And there's no advantage for either team. Florida sends a retiring infielder, Marty Martinez, to Kansas City for a guy you could put on waivers, but you will put on waivers, but might not even get drafted. So that's what that move was. That just balances the books, so these two are in compliance at 40202. Next trade on the books involved, I like this trade, Seattle and the Reds. And oh boy, folks, the Cincinnati Reds are on fire, as you can imagine, this offseason after their dismal finish. Here's a nice trade they made with Seattle. Seattle had Fred Norman, Cincinnati's property. They had this Rod Gilbreth is a good, actually, a 284 hitting third baseman, which is nothing to sneeze at, and Luke Walker, who they were going to be a keep, but the Reds aren't. He turns into a waiver player, and the Reds are going to send a draft token, or actually no, the Reds get the draft token because they're sending Ross Grimsley, Steve Busby to Seattle just to get Fred Norman. They didn't really want Busby anymore. He didn't pitch very well in '73, and they wanted to create space so they can go get Jack Billingham and Don Gullett. So they moved Grimsley to Seattle. So Seattle was very opportunistic in this deal, adding, Busby, who they can improve to a 74 card, Grimsley, who's good through the whole decade. This should really help another expansion team, Seattle. The Reds really wanted to do this to get their guy Norman, but also to get a draft token that they would soon lose. They're going to lose a token for a couple players that are going to be going to the Reds. So in this deal that was made, you see they balanced the books on the years of the players involved, 73 and 74. And then these are, when you don't see a year next to them, it means that they are from a 71 set. And it doesn't really matter if it's keep, waive, or retire. It's just, it's fair. It's a 71 card for a 71 card. So in that accounting, let's take a look at Seattle's accounting. Seattle's accounting didn't change. The Reds' accounting will change, but they got 2 more trades to do. Seattle lost a token. Cincinnati gained a token. By the way, Cincinnati drafts 8th and Seattle drafts 9th, which is crazy to think about. That's how bad Cincinnati's year was. And that's why they're making these moves, to make sure it doesn't happen again. The next trade, and it's not the big one yet. We'll get there. We'll get there, folks. It's coming tonight. You'll see it. The next trade is involving the Rangers. So Cincinnati, a lot of teams in the National League don't want to trade with the Reds, and you can imagine why. Why would you want to give the Big Red Machine all they want? But they'll talk to the Texas Rangers. And in this minor deal, you can call it minor, it's a swap of relievers, a lefty reliever for a righty reliever, and it's a swap of starting pitchers, Jack Billingham and Luke Walker. Now, Luke Walker's a lefty starter, but he's kind of running out of juice. Jack Billingham is a good starting pitcher. The Rangers had too many. So the Reds have to fork over the token they just got to the Rangers. So now they got the one from Seattle, now they give it back to the Rangers. This is just to get Jack Billingham. So technically, when you look at the big picture here, they're trading Ross Grimsley for Jack Billingham. But the good news is they get a lefty reliever in the Cincinnati bullpen because they lost Jim Strickland. All this is pretext for the next blockbuster. And here we go, folks. You're going to need a calculator for this one. We have a trade between the Cincinnati Reds, the Houston Astros, the Baltimore Orioles, Cleveland Indians, and the New York Yankees. We have a 16-player trade that moves all of those prize pieces to where they need to go. So this is the way you break this down. The Cincinnati Reds, they moved on from Lee May and Tommy Helms, and the Astros didn't want Lee May. The Astros did not want Lee May because they had Bob Watson playing first base. The whole problem with Cincinnati is that Tony Perez and Lee May were both first basemen. So why would Houston want that same exact problem? So in this retelling of the tale, Baltimore pipes up and say, we want Lee May. So they get Lee May sooner than 1975. They could get him in 72, 3, or 4 if they want. So Lee May goes to Baltimore in this. We're going to go right down the top. So I'm going to tell you which team loses and gains players. So Cincinnati lost a player. Baltimore gains a player. Tommy Helms goes to Houston to play second base. Cincinnati's lost a second player. Houston picks up a guy. And then a swap of some 73 players. Cincinnati wanted to unload this guy they didn't really want. He's Johnny Bench's backup catcher from 73. They really unloaded him to Houston, Ken Suarez. So now Cincinnati has lost 3 guys. Houston's picked up a second guy here. And now here we go. So Houston will send Joe Morgan to the Cincinnati Reds. So Houston, that was +2 on players, is now +1 on players. The Reds were -3, are now -2. Houston will also send Dennis Mankey, who was actually part of the Joe Morgan trade, to the Reds as part of the deal. He will actually play third base with Rod Gilbreth until eventually Pete Rose moves to third base. So after this next player, Houston, who was +1 on players, is now at 0. And Cincinnati, who was -2, is now -1. Houston sends a waivered player to the Reds that they're going to put on waivers just to help the math. This is just a math helper, balancing the deal. Inconsequential player going on waivers who might be even retired, Gary Peters. So now Houston loses a guy after gaining guys, so they're -1. But the Reds have the proper math. They are sitting at 0 in this player movement. The Astros then sent this catcher, Dick Billings, to the Yankees because they got this Ken Suarez guy to be their catcher. So the Astros are down 2 players, and the Yankees picked up an extra player, this Dick Billings. All right, now, Baltimore, if you remember, way up here, they got the rights to Lee May. So they sent the rights to Boog Powell to Cleveland. So now Baltimore is a wash. 0, they got and lost a guy. Cleveland's +1. So right now the Yankees and Cleveland are +1, and Cincinnati and Houston are perfect. Baltimore also sent Frank Duffy, an active player with a 72 card, to Cleveland. So now Baltimore is -1, and Cleveland's +2. Baltimore also sends Andy Etchebarren, who they have to put on waivers because they have too many guys. He's not particularly fantastic anyway. He goes to the Yankees on waivers, and the Yankees will most likely just leave him there. So Baltimore is now -2. The Yankees, who are +1 up here, are now +2. All right, so Cleveland now, after getting, my goodness, Cleveland got Boog Powell and Frank Duffy. They had to send Chris Chambliss to the Yankees. So Cleveland goes from +2 to +1, and the Yankees are now +3. Mark Belanger goes to Baltimore. So that means Cleveland is back down to 0, and Baltimore, which was at -2, is at -1. Cleveland had to send somebody to Houston. So Houston was -2. So Steve Mangori is a nice lefty setup guy. So you're seeing what Houston's getting is a little bit from a bunch of different teams. They like Tommy Helms. They liked the improved catcher Suarez. They liked getting rid of Gary Peters, and they actually like Steve Mangori, a nice lefty setup guy. And they're going to get one more guy a little bit later in this. So Cleveland's at -1, Houston's at -1, and now the Yankees, finally, that +3, they have to start unloading guys. So they send Fritz Peterson to the Indians. So they go from a +3 to a +2, and Cleveland's got the proper math. The Yankees send Tom Hutton to Baltimore. Baltimore now has the proper math. And Gene Alley goes to Houston. So Houston ends up, basically, for getting rid of Joe Morgan, they end up with Tommy Helms, they end up with Gene Alley, they end up with Steve Mangori, they get a draft token, and they get an improved catcher Suarez. So it's like 3, well, really, obviously Morgan is a huge loss, but if you look at the actual trade of Morgan to the Reds, it was Houston did not get as much as they just got in this deal. So they got Tommy Helms, who will still win a Gold Glove, I think, or he's going to be a 1 in 72. Helms has some good years left. And again, they're going to have Mangori's a lefty setup guy for a weak bullpen, and Alley, and the draft token. So that is the blockbuster deal that moved a bunch of players to it's really the first base carousel. Made a whole lot of sense because Lee May had to find a home, and if the Astros didn't want him, where was he going to go? And Boog Powell, if you're wondering, his big year is in 75 with Cleveland, and of course Chambliss is with the Yankees. So he has to leave Cleveland to go to the Yankees, and the Yankees have Fritz Peterson who goes to Cleveland. So it all makes sense. You see, Baltimore gets their shortstop Belanger. Cleveland gets their shortstop Frank Duffy. And then there's a couple guys in here that can be unloaded. Tom Hutton, Gene Alley. Gene Alley helps Houston's depth in the infield. They had too many corner guys. So they got him in the infield with Doug Rader and Roger Metzger and Tommy Helms. They also have Danny Cater and Rich Reese, left-hand hitting first baseman. So 2 waivered players and a bunch of other guys. 16 players in this deal. And when we go over to the general math for all these clubs involved, Cincinnati was at 50300. They have finally figured out that they're where they need to be. They're at 40400. They still have to move 2 waiver guys to retirement. Let's look at the Reds, because they're obviously the big player here. The big red machine. They had to catch the Pirates, and in this offseason, they're going to attempt to do just that. I have to go to this one. So here they are at 40400. So it's Joe Morgan, Tony Perez, Don Gullett, Jack Billingham. Those are the guys they're going to go add this offseason. The lefty pitchers on the team are going to be Don Gullett, Fred Norman, and that player from Texas, Denny Riddleberger, who's a lefty. He replaces Jim Strickland. Same kind of guy. Guy pitches like 30, 40 innings. Strickland did it for the Twins. Riddleberger did it for the Rangers. Good enough to be the one lefty in the bullpen with Clay Carroll and Bourbon. They lose Granger on that. Perez gets to play first base for the Reds. Morgan at second, Concepcion at short. The third baseman for the Cincinnati Reds this year, 191 hitting Dennis Mankey. And where's Gilbreth at? Rod Gilbreth. There he is. 284 hitting Rod Gilbreth. Yeah, I get it. Not very special, but what are you going to do? You can't get everything, Cincinnati. At least you got Joe Morgan. So they're going to be pretty weak at third base with those guys. Then Houston started at 40301. Let's see how they look now. So Houston's going to keep Tommy Helms, Ken Forsch. They got Steve Mangori, and they have their choice of Bob Johnson and Frank Lindsay, but they're going to have to make another deal to move those guys. They were weak with lefties, so Mangori, LeMaster, Cosgrove, one of these guys are going to unload on San Diego for Dave Roberts. And in the offense, of course, they lost Morgan, who hit 256 for them, so they only added Tommy Helms to the offense. But the idea is that they're going to have a better pitching staff. And frankly, if I had my druthers, I would have kept Joe Morgan with Houston, and Jimmy Wynn. Jimmy Wynn will be traded probably next year, but I'm not, history said that's what happened. The Reds got Morgan from Houston, so that's what I did. I got him from Houston to Cincinnati. All right, so let's go back to the other trades that were made after this humongous deal. We have a trade with Vegas and the Mets. Let's go look at Vegas' situation. Vegas only had 2 guys they wanted to keep. And the New York Mets were sitting there with 8 guys they liked. So it was actually the Mets who probably called Vegas and said, hey, we got some stellar players. I mean, in the last few years, we sent Toronto, Tommy A.G. and Don Clendenon. And so, they convinced Vegas to take on these older players. So Cleon Jones, the third outfielder, sent away from the Mets, from the 69 Miracle Mets team. This time it's Vegas, not Toronto. And Danny Frisella, very good reliever. 2 players leave the Mets, and the Mets just get roster spots. Jim Nettles to put on waivers. Roger Hambright to immediately go into retirement. However, they managed, because Vegas is getting 2 active players and the Mets are getting nothing. Yep, they get 2 tokens. So Vegas kind of all-day sucker there. Looks shiny and sparkly based on the past, but moving forward, these guys are getting old and long in tooth, so we'll see how that works out. But Mets found a sucker to take on the two older players. And I think we just have one more trade for this first group. Yeah. The Dodgers needed a guy. Let's look at their math when this thing started. Yeah, the Dodgers, Boston paused for the moment. You can always resume, but they paused. And the Dodgers had only 3 guys they wanted to keep and 5 guys to retire. So they needed another keeper. The Angels had a ton of guys. And they were fascinated by Jay Johnstone. So that's the guy the Dodgers went out and got. It cost them. It cost them Steve Yeager, a longtime Dodger catcher. And the Dodgers are going to roll their dice with Joe Ferguson as their starting catcher moving forward. And Steve Yeager is going to drive down to Anaheim and play for the California Angels. So he doesn't have to go very far from the Dodgers to the Angels. And the Angels welcome Steve Yeager as a solid catcher with a good throwing arm. When you think about it, Steve Yeager to the Angels makes a lot of sense as a good defensive catcher for most of his career. When you think of that great California pitching staff and how good it would be to have a nice defensive catcher back there. So Borgman is serviceable, but not much else. And so Jay Johnstone, that was the prize the Dodgers wanted, they coveted. They're going to have an older outfield moving on pretty soon. Dusty Baker is going to stay in Atlanta. Reggie Smith is going to stay in St. Louis. All they have is Buckner and Willie Crawford and Willie Davis. So Jay Johnstone has his first monster year in Philadelphia in '75, but the Angels still have the property, and the Dodgers moved in. Again, let's look at the overall draft position here. Here's the Phillies, who had an improbable run to the League Championship Series. And so the Dodgers, in a year they were dismal, they were 4 games under 500, they decided to bump up and make the splash and steal Jay Johnstone away from the Phillies. Johnstone hits 329 or 318, something like that, in '75 for the Phillies. And Johnstone plays for the Dodgers later in the decade. I think in 1980 he'll play for the Dodgers. So the Dodgers get a guy now. That's something I will do every once in a while. When I know a guy eventually plays for a particular team, sometimes I just get him there sooner. So Johnstone will be on the Dodgers and the Phillies. That could hurt them a little bit. They're going to have to, not too much though, they're going to have Luzinski, Gary Maddox, and eventually they'll have Babe McBride in right field. But they're not going to have the services of Jay Johnstone in the middle 70s. That cost the Dodgers a token because Johnstone's a 318, 320 hitter, and Yeager's just a good defensive catcher. So, yeah, that's how the Dodgers decide to go for some offense. We talked about how the Dodgers are just a slap hitting team. They need to get some offense to go with that pitching, and Johnstone will help a lot. And so with that, we've gone through 8 teams thus far, and we'll pick this up and move on with the next group of 8 teams and see what moves they do as we get closer to settling the rosters before the draft next spring. Thanks for checking this out, and we'll see you next time.